The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Peuple a tap tant comme ça. Yo tap demandé dans cœur yo si c'est pas Jean qui Christ là. Laisse ça, Jean dit yo tout. Moi baptiser nous dans de l'eau. Mais il y a un monde qui vient pour venir, qui a plus pouvoir en pile passé moi. Moi-même, moi pas bon assez pour me démarrer contre sapat qui dans pied li. C'est lui-même qui va baptiser nous dans cet esprit ak nan du feu. Les gens finissent baptiser tout le monde, li baptiser Jésus tout. En temps Jésus tape la prière, ciel l'a ouvert. Cet esprit a descendu sous lui en forme d'un petit pigeon. Yon voix sorti dans le ciel là, li dit: ou c'est petite, moi remets en pile là, ou fait comme content en pile. The Gospel of the Lord.
This year, we celebrate our Migration Day Mass on the solemnity of the baptism of Jesus. This year's theme, towards an ever wider we, is taken from Pope Francis's latest encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, and serves to connect this feast of the baptism of Jesus with last week's feast of his Epiphany. At last Sunday's Mass, we sang, "Lord, every nation on earth will adore you." Those nations were represented by the Magi who came to worship the Christ child in Bethlehem. Today, in this cathedral, people from some of the many nations that make up this local church here in South Florida come to adore the Lord, who came among us as a light for the world, a light for the nations. Epiphany, which means manifestation or revelation, celebrated the fact that when Jesus was born as a man in Bethlehem, he came not just for one people, but for all peoples, all races, of all times and places. Today's feast, the baptism of Jesus, is really another epiphany or revelation. For in going into the waters of the Jordan, God's beloved Son wishes to reveal or manifest his solidarity with the entire human race. He comes as a brother to all. As brothers and sisters of Jesus, we should no longer think in terms of them and those, but only us. The church is to carry out the mission entrusted to the apostles by Jesus Christ, go and teach all nations. To do this, we must work together to make the church become ever more inclusive, so that the body of Christ is an ever wider we, embracing everybody, building community and diversity, and unifying differences without imposing a depersonalized uniformity. St. Peter tells us in today's second reading, and I'm sure you all heard it, in truth I see that God shows no partiality. Rather, in every nation, whoever fears him and acts uprightly is acceptable to him. Jesus, in calling us to communion with his Father through the gift of his Spirit, does not demand of us that we change our culture, our language, or even our nationality. He only asks that we change our hearts. If the church is the Father's house, then all those who are God's children through baptism should feel at home and welcomed in their Father's house. God shows no partiality, but sometimes we do. We like our own kind, and we tend to mistrust or are suspicious of the one whom we see as the stranger, as them or those people. Diversity, rather than being seen as a gift, is feared and often blamed for our divisions. But diversity enriches us. Diversity enriches the church and enriches this great nation, which is from many one, a pluribus unum. What divides us is not our diversity. What divides us is sin. Fratelli tutti, Pope Francis reminds us. Fratelli tutti, we are all brothers and sisters. And thus the world must move beyond thinking in terms of them and those, and move to an ever greater we. This universal we must become a reality. First in the church, which is called to cultivate communion and diversity. It is the church that is Catholic, that is universal. It is that church that brings into its communion people of every race, language, and culture. And it is this church, our church, that must teach the world how to live as brothers and sisters. If we Catholics are to be a light to the nations, we must model in the way we live in our families, in our communities, and in our parishes. We must model what a reconciled world looks like. One of the signs of our times is globalization. In itself, globalization is neither good nor bad. It depends on what we make of it. But in a globalized world, goods and merchandise made in one continent are bought and sold in another, half a world away. Information and money can cross borders in an instant. And in a globalized world, so can viruses. Globalization has shrunk the world and has made of us all neighbors. But it hasn't made us brothers and sisters. One of the big realities of globalization is that people also increasingly move across borders, often in very dramatic ways. In the light of the Epiphany of the Lord, which teaches that salvation is for everyone, and considering the baptism of the Lord, in which Jesus shows his solidarity with all humanity, the Church teaches us not to fear the migrant, and the Church warns us not to mistreat the migrant. That is why the Church will continue to speak out on behalf of migrants everywhere. We will continue to advocate on their behalf and urge our public officials to melt their hearts of rocks, of stone, so that magnanimity, rather than mean-spiritedness, will be a best practice in resolving our immigration problems. Today, the presence of so many ethnic groups that form part of our archdiocesan community should be a witness that all can and do find a home in the Catholic Church. Our diversity of languages, cultures, and races give witness to the Catholicity of the gospel message and its call to solidarity. Again, diversity does not divide the body of Christ, it enriches it. For our unity is not founded on race or language or nation of origin. Rather, it is founded on Christ. For we acknowledge one Lord, one faith, one baptism.